The following is an excerpt from today's show by Edward O. Wilson.
Darwin's contribution was essential that led to modern biology. I'm going to make a bold assertion, which I have made in a number of scientific circles. Biology has now created two laws. The first law is that all living processes are ultimately obedient to the laws of physics and chemistry. That's the foundation of molecular and cell biology. The second law is that all living processes of more than just trivial fluctuating kind have originated by evolution through natural selection. I think we have arrived at the two fundamental laws of biology.
Stay tuned now for an enlightening lecture by one of the most acclaimed biologists and respected conservationists of our time, Edward O. Wilson.
Thank you. I'll start with a story about Darwin and William Makepeace Thackeray, or he's involved in it. Darwin is at Down House. He's in the garden. An elderly lady in service to the Darwin family is watching him through the window. He's just sitting there looking at ants. And this, of course, was very important to Darwin, ants were, because he said that if he could not explain how worker ants, who are completely selfless and altruistic, and therefore did not have survival value and reproduction powers of their own, if he could not explain how that originated by natural selection, then his whole theory was at risk. Well, he did explain it, and I won't go into it now, but that was why he was paying so much attention to ants and why they figured prominently in the origin of species. And the lady looking out there said, "What a pity that Mr. Darwin does not have something to pass his time like Mr. Thackeray? Well, he had plenty to pass his time. He was an engine of research and writing. The photograph you see here, somebody bring the lights down. There we go, thank you. Good. The image that you see here is the iconic one of Darwin. 1874, he is 65 years old. He's born February 12th, 1809, as many of you will recognize, same year and date as Abraham Lincoln. He lives until 1883, and upon his deathbed, in order to dispel one myth about what he said, the myth that he was converted back to his original religion, I can tell you what he said. In peace, as an agnostic or an atheist, he said, I am not in the least afraid to die. In 1870, Darwin, after some 11 years after the publication of The Origin of Species, he writes to Joseph Hooker, the great botanist, his friend, his lifelong friend and supporter, and he said, well, it seems to be going well, this matter of acceptance of evolution by natural selection. And he said, oh, how I would like to live long enough to see all of the wonderful things to be discovered. And oh, how I am sure the origin of species will have to be modified as that information comes in. In fact, he lived 13 more years after that letter was written. He was to produce 2 more of the great books of Darwin in 1871 and 1873, and to have a highly productive remaining years of life. These are the 4 great books, and I will be speaking to each one of them individually. In fact, what I'll do is I wanted to introduce a book that I've put together in the anthology I wrote called From So Simple a Beginning, which contains the original edition of each of these 4 great books that are listed in front of you, including a transcription right out of one of the rare copies, the Harvard copy of The Origin of Species. These are the original books, and with my commentary on each one, much in which I say much of what I'll say tonight. And furthermore, I've provided a general index of all of the 4 books together with terms that were used by Darwin, their meaning, in scientific terms, also locations and so on, localities, and terms that fit, modern terms that fit more or less or foreshadow concepts that he was developing in the 4 books. I'm pleased to report that, and for my life anyway, I'll have a culmination of the Darwin year. It's the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species and the 200th anniversary of his birth. I'll have a special involvement in that when, on November 24th, which is the date that 150 years ago Darwin published this book, I will join, I will give the main address for the British Council and the great-grandchildren of Darwin and the original publisher of The Origin of Species, which is still extant, and in London. And that, for me, will be one of the high points of my life, to be allowed to do that. Moving on, we see Darwin at the time he published The Origin of Species. Darwin, as a young man in 1840, and I show you this because of a principle it involved. The bearded savant with which I began this series is not characteristic of the creative scientist who produces the best ideas of his or her life. Rather, the best ideas are produced at about this age or a little beyond. And I have a rule of thumb, only take it half seriously, that goes as follows. Mathematicians peak at 19, physicists at 29, chemists at 39, molecular biologists, or I should say molecular biologists, at 49, and evolutionary biologists at 59, and philosophers never. At any rate, this is the age at which the work really got started. It's 2 years after he writes the first draft of the theory of evolution by natural selection. And here is the title page of this famous book. And once again, here are the titles, which I will keep in front of me and tell you briefly what each is about, and then I will return to them. The Journal of Researches into the Natural History, etc., is, of course, the Voyage of the Beagle, one of the great travel books of all time. This was a narrative of Darwin's 5-year trip around the world on the Beagle, in which he develops a great command of the natural history of much of the world, more than almost anybody had been able to do on a first-hand basis before him. And this was inspirational for his later work. The Origin of Species itself, then the descent of man, when he dropped the other shoe, and finally realizing that, now recognizing that the origin of species was being generally accepted. Among scientists, at least, he felt that now the time was to come and fulfill the promise he had made in the origin when he said, light will be shed upon the origin of man. And now he goes into it full blast in this 1871 book. And then finally, the least recognizable but very important fourth great book is The Expression of the Emotions of Man and Animals, the following year. And I would suggest that these last 3 books really were the ones that he had in mind as sections for the one great book he was going to publish later in his life. But as many of you will remember, in 1858, he received a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, a young collector and naturalist, then in the Malay archipelago. In fact, he was in one of the far reaches of current Indonesia when he wrote his essay based upon his studies of butterflies and other creatures he collected across different islands, and produced the identical theory in broad outline to that of Charles Darwin, that Charles Darwin had been developing for years. So at the urging of his friends, Darwin published an essay of his own on the same topic, and published in its entirety the essay sent to him by Wallace. And that's where the famous essays of the Darwin-Wallace essays of 1858, which gives Wallace credit for being an independent originator of the basic idea. And that was published in a journal of the Linnean Society of London. And at the end of 1858, the president of the Linnean Society of London, in his report, said, "This has been one of those years in which no discovery of outstanding importance appears to have been hit upon." Darwin must have realized even then that he would have to come out with a book and come out quickly. So he sat down and wrote what he called an abstract of all of the work he had done up to that present time, and published it in 1 year as The Origin of Species. But I am certain that he was also working already toward completion of these later sections that appeared as The Descent of Man and The Expression of the Emotions, that together make the big package, the full package. It was Darwin's exacting research, his great care in documenting all that he said, his network of correspondence that created a web of information unavailable to any other living scientist and led him to a confident projection in 1859 of the basic idea of evolution. And so compellingly was it documented for that time especially, and so well written and so important, it immediately captured the attention and the approval of a large percentage of scientists who read it, but also a great deal of opposition, of course, which has continued to the present day. This was the book, The Origin of Species, about which Dobzhansky made the famous remark in 1957, I think it was, that nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution. And that's why many have called, I call, Origin of Species the most important book ever written. And one day on the Charlie Rose show, Jim Watson, the co-discoverer of DNA, and I got carried away and agreed. Darwin was the most important man who ever lived. And of course, that's going to ruffle the feathers of, as they say, flutter the dove coats in different parts of the world. Because, you know, we can all name others contenders. But for all of humanity, Darwin changed the self-perception of the human species. And it was greater than the Copernican revolution in that regard, in that it was not just to show that the Earth was part of a great universe, but it was to show that we ourselves were created probably in a very, or came to our existence in a radically different way than had been imagined, and that this has profound implications for those three great questions of philosophy, which found their way onto the canvas of Paul Gauguin's Tahitian masterpiece. Where did we come from? Who are we? Where are we going? Certainly the first two questions now were answered in a very different way, or partly answered, or at least posed in a heuristic and productive way. Now, let me bring us come to the essence, the summary of what each was, and I will then cover each one of these in the time I have remaining to show you that the great books of Darwin, the four of them together, represent more than just four masterpieces back to back, but also are a summary of a scientist's life, from his young manhood through in the development of his thought to the first major breakthrough in thinking about these subjects, and on to the way he elaborated them. This is a kind of scientific biography contained in this collection. The Voyage of the Beagle, one of the great travel books of all time, gave the world a view it had not had, with quite the frankness, directness, and fine detail founded upon scientific knowledge as it was in the early 1830s. It makes fascinating reading for that, because for that reason alone, for a modern reader, it takes you back, and because the Beagle had artists who depicted these various subjects and places, we see it almost like a series of photographs, of snapshots from someone's world tour. We actually see how it looked as he describes them, these places and the people, in his book. The Origin of Species, I will come to again, presents the basic idea that not only does evolution occur, that was already well bandied about, but also a mechanism that was universal and might explain it. The descent of man, well, that's exactly what that was an account of the best Darwin could get of it, of where humanity came from. And he suggested that we came from Africa and that we descended from apes or ape-like creatures. And the son of a gun, he was right. This guy, it's infuriating. This guy is almost always right. When he falls short, it's just because there's no way to think about something. That was in the case of particulate heredity. He got that wrong. He thought heredity was like a fluid. It was continuous in its composition and the way it flowed together from parent to offspring. But most of the time, he just nailed it in ways that I think have merit to the present time. The expression of emotions in man and animals was revolutionary in comparing us to animals in the way and the expression of emotions, and I'll come to that when the time is appropriate. But now let's move to the voyage of the Beagle, and this is the route he took from 1831 to 1835. It was a very long trip. It was taken because, as a very young man, 22 years old, he got a break from one of his relatives. He'd been trained as a minister at Cambridge University after he had simply come back from medical school in Edinburgh, to the great disappointment of his father, Robert Darwin. So he does train for the ministry, and he's a devout young man at this time. But he desperately would like to be a naturalist. And a relative said, well, there's an opening on this Beagle, which is going to conduct a coast and geodetic survey of South America. It's a long voyage, but maybe we could get you on that if you'd like to go. We now know that part of the function of the naturalist on the Beagle was to be a companion to Captain Fitzroy, an irascible gentleman who otherwise would be left alone at dinner table conversations on board. He needed someone, a companion that he could talk to without deference, without fear of bias due to deference, and to whom he could really exchange ideas and experiences with. So Darwin fitted that exactly, even though he was a very young man. So off we go, and the first one of the first ports of call, maybe the first on the continent anyway, was the port of Rio de Janeiro, and here he is, how it looked exactly as when he arrived in 1831, and now he has the great desire to go ashore and proceed inward a little bit to the great tropical Atlantic forest of eastern Brazil. This is an ecosystem of tropical rainforest different from the Amazon forest. It's been mostly wiped out. It's down to below 10% of cover now, but it covered all the state of Sao Paulo at the time, almost all of it. And Darwin was eager to see this. This was going to be a great experience for him. He was going to collect insects and various kinds of creatures that he discovered. He was going on an exploration, but he got hung up, and so did the rest of his party, into a limited little area at the, this is the mole here in the cathedral, and he wasn't allowed out by the immigration or whatever they were, customs officials. And he writes in his notebook, I would kiss the dust off the feet of these people if they would just let me through. And finally they do. And he, in a way never expressed in his books, in his notes, is rhapsodic and beautifully poetic about his first experience in the tropical forest. It is transformative to him to see nature in its most glorious. We've just seen a review of America's national parks. They are magnificent, especially as rock and ice parks. But believe me, a few square, 100 square miles of tropical forest like that, the Atlantic forest or the Amazon, dwarfs them in the variety of life found there. And that's what he began to start. This is where This is the foredeck of the Beagle, a very crowded space for him to live in. So much of his time he got off whenever he could and took off across country with a mule train or a horse and companion of his own to meet the Beagle down the coast and reboard there. This is where he lived, and gives you a sense of this very confined community or habitat for this community, the voyage of the Beagle. And this is one of the Fuegians. It was a now extinct Amerindian tribe they came across at the extremity of South America, at the Terra del Fuego, and lived under terrifyingly difficult conditions of climate, food shortage, and the like. He was very impressed, though, by how well they had adapted to that environment. And then, coming up the other coast, we come to Concepcion, and not too long after the great earthquake that leveled that city. He, at this point, was beginning to think about evolution of a kind. He was thinking particularly about geological evolution, because one of the books that he took with him at the beginning of the voyage, in addition to the Bible, was Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. And Charles Lyell, in Principles of Geology, had introduced the idea called uniformitarianism. And Lyell said in this book, look, the mountains of the earth, the great craters, the coves, the flat plains, the little islands that are in the sea, they were not created by one great sweep of the hand or of any creative force in a short period of time. They came into being over a very long period of time. Well, geologic time, I think Lyell understood this could be millions of years. And he said, what you see today of the topography of the world is the result of vast numbers of small changes that occur year by year, decade by decade, or in the case of some of the great seismic events like this one, maybe once every century or half a century. And it changes the world. You can see how it changes the world. And all this accumulated over millions of years explains the great variety of landforms and sea approaches and so on that characterize the planet Earth's surface. Darwin bought into that. He really saw the logic of it. And I think this was part of the beginning of the notion in his own head that maybe evolution was also occurring in the creatures living on the surface of the planet, although he never is completely clear about that. At any rate, finally, the second half of the voyage is entered, and then finally they slowly begin a homeward journey of immense length. They go to Tahiti. No, this is the Galapagos. They stop at the Galapagos Islands off the coast, 500 miles off the South American coast. Volcanic, sparsely diverse islands with a small fauna and flora, but spectacular creatures there that clearly have evolved there in isolation, and probably because of isolation of the Galapagos. Now, Darwin spends, in spite of the fact that the Galapagos have become a kind of sacred site for those who would like to track Darwin's career or just to talk about evolution in any form. In spite of that, Darwin himself only spent a hurried 6 weeks there. And he was, in my mind, he was obviously homesick. He wanted to get on across the Pacific and home. So he didn't pay that close attention. It was Fitzroy who pointed out to him that the Galapagos tortoises differ from one island to the other, and that idea stuck. And he collected birds. He collected some of the famous Darwin's finches, which have become classic in studies of species formation. But he didn't pay much attention to those. It was later an ornithologist at the British Museum, Gould, who told him that there was something really interesting going on there with those finches. But he did notice there were differences among the mockingbirds. And we now know from his notes that as he sailed on across the Pacific, he took note of that and started thinking about the whole thing and about islands generally. And finally he decided that maybe forms of life are not immutable, maybe that they evolve, particularly in places like the Galapagos where different forms evolve on different islands. And he had the mockingbirds in mind. So he wrote a friend of his about this time, "I know it is like confessing murder, but I now no longer believe that species are really immutable," and so on then across Tahiti and homeward. And then he begins to think about evolution. The idea first comes to him in 1838, and he's totally committed then. He said he was out on a carriage ride and had just finished reading Malthus, Thomas Malthus, the economist of the turn of the century, who had proclaimed that humanity was always going to be in trouble because we increased our resources arithmetically, but we increased our numbers geometrically, or as we say, exponentially, and that there would always be in humanity a constant pressure and competition for limited resources because of our capacity to reproduce exponentially. And Marwin was muddling over that idea, and he said, well, maybe that's true of other creatures as well. And it came to him that creatures also, plants, animals also multiply exponentially, and that in fact the resources in many places are practically constant, so they must be competing rather heavily. And then it occurred to him, because he was so familiar with variation within domestic animals, after all he lived in a very rural environment there at Down House, that somehow maybe some of those could be evolving, leaving others behind, and even allowing other kinds to go extinct. And he saw that, well, that's what we do, isn't it? With our domestic animals, we breed them up. We've got, but he didn't call it that, but they got genetic variation. And some of those are selected by us. And what do you know? We've produced a huge multitude of different strains, almost different species of plants and animals that way. So finally it dawned on him. Now, he did not believe, oh, I forgot to mention Emma, his first cousin of Wedgwood, lots of wealth. I remember the tradition that Harvard professors were not expected to get much of a salary when they were called to Harvard by the likes of Mr. Eliot and Mr. Lowell. They were expected to marry young Brahmin women who found Harvard professors, for reasons not entirely clear to me in this day and time, suitable matches for their extra young daughters, and that the wealth thereby accruing, combined with, as Mr. Eliot said, what Harvard professors were expected to earn on the side. He said any professor here worth his salt can earn more than his salary, allowed many of them to become wealthy. Well, in the case of Darwin, he married his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, of the Wedgwood family, and he was a Wedgwood himself. So he had considerable wealth, allowing him then to live in comfort not far outside London at the Down House, and to spend all of his time engaged in research on the subjects pertaining to evolution, in fact, all aspects of natural history, and it was a long and productive life. They had 12 children. It was productive in more ways than one. It was my privilege, incidentally, to meet the last granddaughter alive. Her name was Laura Barlow. I got to have tea with her in 1982. She was the one who gave us Darwin's unexpurgated biography with all sorts of nice revelations in it that the family had earlier kept from public eye. It is worthwhile to mention Lamarck, who the French zoologist, who in 1810 had published a long treatise based on extensive knowledge of a variety of animals on evolution, and he had proposed what we call, of course, Lamarckism, which is the inheritance of acquired characters. But his theory was never accepted because it just didn't really fit. It didn't seem to fit a lot of facts. Lamarckism was a theory that the effort of plants and animals, the effort of famously a giraffe to reach high foliage stretching its neck, the effort of desert plants to reach water by sending deeper and deeper roots. This effort is translated, according to Lamarck, into hereditary traits. So the offspring of striving parents have that trait to start with, or a little bit of it, and that's how evolution progresses. Now, in time, that turned out to be testable and was easily dismissed, but Darwin didn't want to accept it anyway. It didn't seem to fit all he knew, and he was on to something brand new. Now, let me then tell you, in essence, what Darwinism is. The theory of natural selection, evolution by natural selection. It's very simple. There are constantly occurring in the DNA mutations, alterations in the code that produce different products in the phenotype, that is body form, skin color, ability to adjust lactose or whatever. Countless traits are affected by these mutations. And they're seen in all of the traits that are hereditary, can be passed on to our offspring. And there's variation among all individuals, whether it's snails on a seashore or human beings, everywhere. This is a characteristic. Some of these live longer and produce more offspring that reach maturity than others. You can either be more fit, genetically fit, as we say, by leaving more offspring even in a short lifespan. And then each of those tends to leave lots of offspring, even if they have a short lifespan. Or you can have a very long lifespan, like some of the deep sea creatures do. And leave very few offspring, but from generation to generation, that's what counts. You can then leave, if it's just several more offspring than your neighbor, who doesn't live quite as long, then you have the edge. So natural selection then really is the differential selection of individuals by the number of different individuals of differing heredity in their contribution to who gets into the next generation and arrives and has offspring of their own. And that's been mathematically worked out in enormous detail and documented in fine detail by countless research programs around the world since Darwin's time. And that is then, in essence, Darwinism. Suppose that you had a population of brown-eyed birds completely. A mutation appears, and you have a red-eyed bird, which for some reason, maybe differential better vision of catching of insects to be caught, does a little bit better than the brown. In a while, the population begins to change statistically to more and more red-eyed birds until finally, perhaps, the last of the brown-eyed birds die out and you have a red-eyed species. And then comes along a green-eyed bird mutation. That's a little better, and they gradually increase differentially until finally that species is green-eyed. And that's what Darwin thought of in terms of evolution of new species. He said new species vertically emerge from others. He didn't spend a lot of time worrying about how species multiply so that we might end up with red-eyed birds that have a blue crest next to a population with red-eyed birds with a gray crest. And that's all around us. We know the species multiply. He didn't spend a lot of time. It was his colleague and co-discoverer of natural selection, Wallace, who worked that out starting around 1865, but that's another story. We now move quickly on to the second descent of man and sexual selection. And what I'll illustrate, since these illustrations are from his books, this is from The Descent of Man, is a special section he added on, as it was an add-on, called sexual selection. And in it, he pointed that in group after group, different kinds of animals around the world, males often are larger. They often, being larger, have structures designed obviously for fighting. And you can see they fight for females and fight to have a territory that they occupy by themselves. The females then enter. And they can have a kind of runaway selection so that you have bizarre horns, as in a 10-point buck deer. And the fights are sometimes lethal, and it doesn't seem to make much point except to be the one that gets to mate with females. So you have males on the left here, and then of the same species, the females. This, you might think, should lead to evolution in which males are produced that have ghastly large size and long horns and enormous fighting ability. Well, in a small number of groups, that sort of absurd or extreme evolution occurred. But in most, it does come to a limit. And recent research has shown that beetles like the ones on the top, species have actually two forms of males. They can have the same, they can just slightly different genetic basis, but they belong to the same species, the two. And there's the great horned ones that fight. They stay in where they were born, and they fight with other big horned beetles until they have their own territory. They've thrown every other male out of there, and then they get to mate with a female. But they're also little males, no bigger than the females. And they don't have horns at all. They fly away with the females that are prone to fly away. And because they're dispersing, the species is always dispersing. So they then land in territory not occupied by big horned males, but where the females arrive too. And they get a mate among those females. And therefore, tiny or males with tiny horns survive, and you have both kinds surviving. This is what I call the John Wayne versus Woody Allen distinction. Let me run through other examples of this principle, not the two male form one, but the big horned or highly equipped males. Male on top, the fighting species, the fighting sex. The two kinds of lizards, these are chameleons of Madagascar, male horned on top, female plain on the bottom. This is a kind of lizard very common in the West Indies. The male has bright colors and this display dewlap that it shows off. Hummingbirds are among the many birds in which you have these two forms. And then the ruff is a dramatic example with which Darwin was familiar of exactly the same phenomenon. And now we come finally to the expression of emotions in human, man and animals. Darwin could not help but notice, as all of us who own dogs notice, that animals tend to have body postures and even facial expressions that indicate powerful emotions. The family dog can be aggressive and will show it by posture and the bristling of fur and the raising of tail and the snarling and growling. In contrast to good old Fido, the one that meets you at the door and goes through submission postures. After all, you are the big alpha male. And he saw that this was just uniform. And particularly in the primates, he saw that chimpanzees had a wide variety of expressions that were almost human-like, and that the postures and signals and the sounds of animals, as for example in this threatening hen, they characterize the behavior of animals generally. That emotions, where emotions can be expressed paralinguistically by sounds and postures and movements, they occur. So he turns his attention in this last section to the most advanced biological science of the day, and that's anatomy. And he enters himself into a study of the muscles that control facial expressions, and then classifies them or uses existing classifications by anatomists of the time to study the meaning of different human expressions and compared them with the subtleties of meaning differences in animals as he understood them. And then he also hired actors to show these expressions. He used his children and got them to show these expressions. He had them photographed. So these are this is from the expressions of the emotion of man and animals, one of the first examples of photographs being used in a book. And so he pioneered there. Although this is one of the lesser known books, it is nonetheless seen now as a foundation piece for modern psychology and modern behavior studies, objective studies, including field studies of human expression and gestures. And Konrad Lorenz went so far as to call him the father of psychology. If I can have the lights now, I'll conclude. Darwin's contribution was essential as on the road that led to modern biology in all of its aspects, and I'll explain now why and give you a sense of where I think biology is going. I'm going to make a bold assertion, which I have made in a number of scientific circles, including most recently at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, which is full of cynical, sharp-nosed, nitpicking molecular biologists. And I've said biology has now created two laws. The first law is that all living processes are ultimately obedient to the laws of physics and chemistry. That's the foundation of molecular and cell biology. The second law is that all living processes of more than just trivial fluctuating kind have originated by evolution through natural selection. I think we have arrived at the two fundamental laws of biology. Now, that then allows us to look a little bit into the future. And I would like then to mention what is happening, namely that two strategies of research are occurring, have now manifested themselves very clearly. And I can express them this way. The first strategy is that for every problem in biology there exists a species ideally suited for its solution. And that's what molecular cell biologists do. You know, they get the little nematode for studying cell basis of behavior exactly. They took E. coli and gave us a lot of basic molecular genetics and so on. But they are limited to a very small number of species. And that's been, their focus has been laser-like, very effective but laser-like. The second strategy is the inverse. It is the inverse. It's expressed as, for every group of organisms, birds, salamanders, snails, bacteria, there exist phenomena or problems to the solution of which that group is ideally suited. So you would not take elephants for genetic studies, but you would take them for advanced forms of social behavior and ecological studies and so on. So in the first category, you have the problem solvers, and in the second category, you have the naturalist. And we have a new definition of naturalist. A real naturalist is someone that loves a particular group of organisms. It can be more than one particular group, but tends to love it and want to work at it all his or her life, who will do anything to get where they can work on this group and see them all the time and study them, and then learn everything they can. Every little piece of information is valuable. They're not initially trying to solve a problem, but they soon become aware of problems that no one else has seen and that for which their group is ideally suited, and then they make a major contribution to general biology by using that group. I think that biology now has reopened the chapter for naturalists. It is the study of the little-known biological diversity of life, the little-known diversity of life on this planet. And we're just beginning now to explore with new vigor and with new, how should I put it, with new stature, that part of biology. Modern biology is going to go through along two prongs. Those following the first strategist, the structural biologists, are answering the questions of phenomenon after phenomenon, how, and the naturalists are discovering the phenomenon in the first place in many cases. And they're answering the question, why, how it came into being, what it means, how it fits in. So with that, I thank you for listening, and I think we have time for maybe a question or two.
After the lecture, I asked Dr. Wilson why he wrote this book on Darwin.
This is a book that has been badly needed by scientists and general readers. It is the actual books themselves as Darwin wrote them in the first edition, and I've put them together in a set that is chronological, and it kind of tells the story of Darwin's life, from his voyage as a young man around the world to the development of his ideas that started with animals and plants and went on to the end in humans. And it has, as part of the contribution, my commentary on what each of these books proves, or at least proposed, as well as an index I prepared, a general index that covers all four books together, and has the terms that Darwin used, the places he was in, and also even modern terms for ideas that he had but he didn't formulate very well, to help the reader and the historian identify where to look. And I think that's going to be a very effective way then to get into Darwin and do general reading and also scholarly research.
Well, thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you.